A baton smashed through the driver's window. Glass sprayed across the seat and onto the gravel. A second blow cracked the tail light, then a third caved in the side mirror. Inside the truck, a dog screamed. Not barked, screamed. The old man's hands went up, slow and open, and he did not shout. He knelt down in the dirt beside the shattered door and pressed one palm flat against the trembling animal's chest. The two deputies kept swinging. They figured the rusted pickup belonged to some drifter nobody would miss. They had no idea the plates traced to Everett Calhoun, a retired Navy admiral who once commanded men in places these boys would never find on a map. And that gray-muzzled shepherd bleeding on the seat wore a certified service vest they never bothered to read. What did this old man do next? Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and show you how this started because it matters. Cedar Hollow, Montana, is the kind of town where the same 30 families have run things for 100 years. One traffic light, a diner, a hardware store, a feed supply, and a sheriff's office with 4 deputies and a coffee pot that never gets cleaned. People here know each other's trucks better than they know each other's names. And that was part of the problem, because Everett Calhoun's truck was one nobody recognized. He'd bought that pickup new, 30 years back, a green Ford with a bench seat and a manual choke. Over the years, the paint had gone chalky, the tailgate had a dent from a runaway shopping cart in Norfolk, and the whole thing rattled like a coffee can full of bolts. Everett could have bought 10 new trucks. He had the pension, the savings, the medals in a shoebox he never opened. But this truck had carried him to his wife's chemo appointments for 2 years before she passed. It had carried her casket in its own way, riding behind the hearse the whole slow way to the cemetery. You don't trade in a thing like that. You keep it until one of you dies. That morning, he'd driven 40 minutes down from the cabin he'd bought after retiring. He came into town twice a week. Once for groceries, once for the hardware store, and every single time he brought Ranger. Ranger was 10 years old, a German shepherd with a gray muzzle and hips that didn't work like they used to. But he wasn't a pet, not exactly. Ranger was a certified service animal, trained and papered, and he wore a vest that said so in bright yellow letters. Do not pet. Service dog. Working. Everett had panic episodes. The kind that come from a life spent in rooms where decisions cost lives, and from a marriage that ended in a hospital bed. When his chest seized up and the world tilted, Ranger would press his whole weight against Everett's legs until it passed. That dog had pulled him back from the edge more times than any pill ever had. So when I tell you Everett loved that dog, understand I mean the dog was the last living thing on earth that needed him. And he was the last living thing that needed the dog. Now here's the thing about small towns. They talk. And that morning, somebody had talked. There'd been a string of break-ins over by the county road. A tool shed, a hunting cabin, a truck stereo. Nothing violent, but enough to make people jumpy. And the day before, a woman named Cheryl Danvers, who ran the front counter at the feed store and had opinions about everyone, called the sheriff's office to report a suspicious vehicle. An old green pickup with an out-of-county look to it. A rough-looking older man inside, and a big dog. She said she'd seen it parked near the edge of town twice that week, and didn't the deputies think that was worth looking into? It wasn't much, but it landed on the wrong desk. Deputy Kyle Brennan was 24 and had been wearing a badge for 8 months. Deputy Trent Mackey was 26 and had been wearing one for a year and a half. Both of them were bored out of their minds in a town where the biggest call of the month was usually a cow on the highway. Both of them wanted to matter, wanted a story to tell. And when the description of that green pickup came over the radio that morning, and Trent spotted it rolling slow down Main Street, something in both of them lit up like a slot machine. "That's it," Trent said. "That's the truck from the report." Kyle keyed the radio, got eyes on the suspicious vehicle from yesterday, Green Ford, older male, large dog. We're gonna make contact. Nobody at the office told them to slow down. Nobody asked a single question. The sheriff was 2 counties over at a training seminar. It was just the two of them, a slow morning, and a truck they decided was guilty before it even parked. Everett pulled into the gravel lot beside the hardware store, same spot he always used. He shut off the engine, reached over and scratched Ranger behind the ears. 2 minutes, old man, he said. Just need a box of screws and some wire. He didn't even get his door open. The cruiser came in fast and hard, angling across the lot to block him in, tires spitting gravel. Both deputies came out with their hands already near their belts. And here's where you have to understand something. Everett had spent 40 years reading men in tense situations. He knew, the instant he saw their faces, that these 2 boys had already made up their minds. He'd seen that exact look on 19-year-olds outside villages that no longer exist. The look of somebody who's decided you're the enemy and is just waiting for permission to act on it. So Everett did what he was trained to do. He went still. He put both hands flat on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and he waited. That's how it stood. 2 young deputies, 1 old man, 1 gray dog, and a whole town about to find out exactly who they'd cornered. "Step out of the vehicle," Trent barked, though Everett hadn't moved. "Hands where I can see them." "My hands are on the wheel," Everett said, calm and even. "I'm going to open the door slowly. There is a service dog in the cab. He's old and he startles. Please don't reach in." But young men who have decided they're heroes don't hear words like that. They hear defiance. Trent grabbed the door handle and yanked it. It was locked. And that little bit of resistance, that tiny nothing of a locked door, is what tipped the whole thing over the edge. "He's locking us out," Trent said, like it was proof of something. "Pop the lock," Kyle said. "Officers," Everett said, louder now but still level, "I'm unlocking it. Give me 1 second." He reached for the lock, and Ranger, seeing a stranger's hands clawing at the door, seeing his human's voice go tight, did what any dog would do. He surged up off the seat and let out a deep, roaring bark, teeth flashing behind the glass. That was it. That was the excuse. "Dog," Kyle shouted. "He's got an aggressive dog." What happened next took maybe 15 seconds. Trent yanked his baton and drove it straight through the driver's window. Glass exploded inward. Ranger yelped and scrambled back against the far door, and a shard opened a cut above his eye. Kyle went around the front and knocked out a headlight, then the side mirror, screaming the whole time about the suspect resisting, about the animal, about backup that nobody had called for and nobody needed. Trent swung again and took out the little triangle window. He was breathing hard, wild-eyed, high on his own adrenaline. And Everett Calhoun did not fight back. He could have. Understand that. Even at 68, with 2 bad knees and a titanium plate in his shoulder, Everett knew 40 ways to put both of those boys on the ground before they finished their next breath. His hands knew it before his mind did. There was a half second, right when the glass hit Ranger and the dog cried out, when every cell in his body screamed to move. He didn't, because Everett had learned the hardest lesson of his whole life a long time ago. The most powerful thing a man can do in a room full of people who want him to lose control is refuse to give it to them. If he put those deputies down, he'd be the violent old vagrant they'd already decided he was. The story would write itself. So instead he did the one thing they never expected. He opened the door, slow, into the ruin of glass. He got down on his knees in the gravel. And he reached in and gathered his terrified, bleeding dog against his chest, wrapping his own body around Ranger like a shield, murmuring to him in a low, steady voice while the deputies stood over him, chests heaving. "You're all right," he told the dog. "You're all right, I've got you. I've got you." Then he lifted his head, And he looked up at Trent Mackey, and his voice came out perfectly calm. "Son," he said, "I'd like your badge number. Yours and your partner's, that's all, just your badge numbers." That threw them. They'd expected screaming, threats, a fight they could justify. Instead, here was this old man on his knees in the glass, holding a bleeding dog, and all he wanted was 2 numbers written down. It rattled Trent enough that he actually took a step back. "You don't get to demand anything," Kyle said, trying to sound in control. "You've got an aggressive animal and you failed to comply." "I complied with everything you said," Everett answered, still not raising his voice. "My hands were on the wheel. The dog is a certified service animal. His vest is right there on the seat where you can read it. And you broke my window before I could get the door open." He looked from one of them to the other. "Now, your badge numbers, and I'd like you to call your supervisor to the scene, please." Something in how he said please made both of them uneasy. It wasn't a plea. It was an order dressed as a courtesy. It was the voice of a man who had spent his entire life giving orders that got followed, and who fully expected these two to follow this one. Trent recovered his bluster. "We're not calling anybody. You're gonna step over there and put your hands on the hood while we sort out who you are." "All right," Everett said. He set Ranger down gently, checked the cut over the dog's eye with 2 fingers, told him to stay, and rose to his feet. His knees popped. He walked to the front of the cruiser and put his hands flat on the warm hood, calm as a man waiting for a bus. He gave them his name, Everett Calhoun. He told them his wallet was in his left back pocket and that his identification was in it and that they were welcome to it. Kyle pulled the wallet, flipped it open, and went quiet, because tucked behind the driver's license was a second card, a military identification card, retired flag officer. And under the name Everett Calhoun was a rank that made the blood drain out of Kyle Brennan's face. He nudged Trent, showed him. For a second, neither deputy said a word. The gravel lot went dead quiet. And that quiet is where I'm going to stop for one moment, because if you've made it this far and you want to see exactly how this ends, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This story turns hard from here and you're going to want to be around for it. Now, back to that quiet parking lot. Kyle handed the wallet back like it had gotten hot. Trent tried to laugh it off. "Anybody can carry an old ID card," he said, but his voice had lost its edge and both of them knew it. Everett straightened up slowly. He picked the military card out of the wallet and held it up, not toward them, but up into the light so the seal caught the sun. "That's real," he said quietly. "I earned every letter of it. But that's not the point, and I want you to hear me. The point is that dog." He nodded toward the cab where Ranger sat trembling with blood on his fur. "You didn't read his vest. You didn't ask a single question. You saw an old truck and an old man and you decided what we were. And you were wrong. So now, we are going to wait right here and you are going to call your sheriff, because this is bigger than the 3 of us and it's going to get bigger still." Trent's jaw tightened. He was young, and being wrong in front of somebody felt worse to him than actually being wrong. "You're giving orders now," he said. "This is my scene, my town. You don't come in here in a junk truck and tell me how to do my job." And that right there, that was the moment the whole thing changed shape. Because up until that point, this had been about a broken window and a scared dog. Ugly but small. A local mess. But when Trent Mackey planted his feet and decided that being challenged was worse than being wrong, he made a choice. He decided to double down. He decided to make sure this old man couldn't tell anyone. And Everett saw it in his eyes, the same way he'd seen 100 bad decisions made by scared young men before. "Give me your phone," Trent said suddenly to Everett. "You recording this?" "No," Everett said. "Empty your pockets now." "Trent," Kyle said, low, uneasy. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Kyle." Trent's hand had drifted to the grip of his sidearm. Not drawn, just resting there, but it was enough. The nature of the whole thing had just flipped, and everyone in that lot felt it. This was no longer two deputies who'd made a mistake. This was two deputies deciding the mistake couldn't be allowed to survive. It wasn't about a dog anymore. It was about whether an old man was going to be allowed to walk out of that parking lot and be believed. Everett read all of it in a heartbeat, and his whole demeanor shifted, not into anger, into something colder and far more precise. The knees stopped mattering. The years fell off him. What stood in that gravel lot now was the man who'd walked into rooms full of people who wanted him dead and walked back out again. "Son," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and flat. "Take your hand off that weapon. Right now." Trent didn't. "Or what, old man? Or you're going to spend the rest of your life explaining a decision that took you half a second to make," Everett said. "I've watched men make that decision. I've had to write letters to their mothers afterward. You do not want to be one of them. So, take your hand off the weapon and step back, and let's all go home tonight." There was a long, terrible beat where nobody moved. A truck passed on Main Street. Somewhere a screen door banged. And into that silence came the one thing that broke it. Ranger, sensing the change in the air, sensing his human stress spiking, dragged himself up out of the shattered cab. He came around the door on stiff legs, blood drying over one eye, and he did not lunge at the deputies. He crossed the gravel, pressed his whole weight against Everett's legs, and looked up at him. Doing his job, even hurt, even scared. Doing the one thing he'd been trained his entire life to do, which was to stand between his person and the thing that was hurting him. And something about that old dog choosing that exact moment to do his duty. It cut through everything. Trent's hand came off the weapon. His face crumpled just slightly, the bluster leaking out of him. Because even a scared young man who's made a terrible choice can see loyalty like that and feel, for 1 second, ashamed. But shame doesn't undo a call already made. Because Kyle, rattled and wanting cover, had already keyed his radio a minute earlier and requested backup, using the words aggressive subject and possible weapon. And 40 minutes out, that call had reached exactly the wrong ears, and exactly the right ones. Because two people were now driving toward Cedar Hollow at high speed. One was County Sheriff Dale Whitcomb, who'd stepped out of his training seminar to a voicemail that made his stomach drop. And the other was a man named Colonel Raymond Alt, base commander from the joint installation 3 counties over, who happened to be Sheriff Whitcomb's fishing partner, and who happened, when Whitcomb read him the name Everett Calhoun off the incident log, to go completely silent on the phone for a full 10 seconds before saying 4 words. "I'm coming with you." Whitcomb didn't understand why a base commander would drop everything for a name off a small-town incident report. He was about to find out. The two of them came into that gravel lot in a cloud of dust, the sheriff's SUV and the colonel's staff car nose to tail. Doors flew open. And Sheriff Dale Whitcomb, a heavy-set man of 50 with a walrus mustache and 40 years of law enforcement behind him, took one look at the scene and felt the whole thing go cold in his gut. The smashed truck, the glass everywhere. An old man standing with his hands loose at his sides and a bleeding shepherd pressed against his leg. And his 2 youngest deputies, white as sheets, standing there with batons still out. "What in God's name," Whitcomb breathed, "did you two do?" Colonel Alt didn't say anything at all. He walked straight past the deputies, past the sheriff, straight to Everett Calhoun, and he stopped in front of him and came to attention. Then this decorated colonel in full uniform raised his hand and held a crisp salute, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "Admiral," he said, "it's an honor, sir. I served under your command. Alt, the Gulf, the second tour. You pulled my whole team out when everyone said we were gone." The gravel lot went absolutely silent. Kyle Brennan made a small sound in his throat. Trent Mackey stared at the ground, Everett looked at the colonel for a long moment. Then quietly he returned the salute. "At ease, Ray," he said. "It's good to see you. I wish it were under better circumstances." Sheriff Whitcomb was looking back and forth between the colonel and the old man like the ground had opened under him. "Somebody," he said slowly, "is going to tell me what is happening, right now." So Everett told him, calm, precise. No exaggeration and no mercy, just the plain sequence of events. He'd parked where he always parked. He'd told them there was a service dog. He'd kept his hands visible. They'd broken his window before he could open the door, injured the dog, refused to give their badge numbers, refused to call a supervisor, and here Everett paused and looked directly at Trent. "And then this young man put his hand on his sidearm and asked me, quote, or what, old man, when I asked him to step back." Whitcomb turned to Trent so fast his neck cracked. "You did what?" "He was giving orders," Trent said weakly. "He wouldn't comply." "He's a retired admiral, you absolute fool," Whitcomb roared, and his voice bounced off the hardware store wall. "He commanded Joint Special Operations. He has commanded more men than live in this entire county. And you drew down on him over a broken tail light on his own truck in a parking lot." He was shaking now. "And the dog? Did you people even look at the dog? That's a service vest. That's a federal protection. You assaulted a certified service animal on video because that hardware store has a camera pointed right at that spot, and I guarantee you it caught every second of this." Trent looked up at the storefront, at the little black dome camera under the eave, and whatever was left of the color drained out of his face. But here's what makes Everett Calhoun who he is. Because at that exact moment when he had won completely, when the sheriff was ready to strip both those deputies of their badges on the spot and the colonel was standing witness and the camera had it all, that was the moment Everett did the thing that shocked everyone. He knelt down, not to the dog this time. He knelt down to gather himself. Then he stood, walked over to Trent Mackey, the young man who put a hand on a gun, and he put out his hand. "What's your name, son?" he said. "Your real name, not your badge number." Trent stared at the offered hand. "Trent," he managed. "Trent Mackey." "Trent." Everett kept his hand out until, confused, the young man shook it. "How long you been wearing that badge?" "A year and a half." "You scared out here, bored, trying to prove you matter?" Trent's eyes filled up, and he couldn't answer, which was answer enough. "I know that feeling," Everett said quietly, so only Trent could really hear it. "I was you once. 19 years old, a weapon in my hands, and a decision to make about a man I'd already decided was my enemy. And I made the wrong one." He let that sit. "I've carried it my whole life. I'm not going to let you carry the same weight for the same reason if I can help it, but you don't get to walk away clean. That dog is hurt. That truck is wrecked. And a man with a gun and a badge decided an old stranger's life was worth less than his pride. That has to mean something, or none of it does." He stepped back, turned to the sheriff. "Dale," he said, "I'm not going to tell you how to run your department, but I'll tell you what I'd want if it were mine." And that's the part that turned the whole department upside down. Not the salute, not the rank. What Everett asked for. He didn't ask for the 2 deputies to be fired. He could have. One phone call to the right office and both careers would have ended by sundown, and nobody would have blinked. Instead, standing in that lot with his dog leaning against his leg, he asked for 3 things. First, that ranger see a veterinarian that afternoon on the department's dime, and that the vest be entered into the record so no officer in that county could ever claim ignorance again. Second, that both deputies be required to complete real training, not a video. Real training on service animals, on de-escalation, on the simple discipline of asking a question before drawing a conclusion. And third, and he was looking right at Trent when he said it, that both young men come out to his cabin one Saturday a month for a year and split firewood and fix fence with an old man and an old dog. Not as punishment, as acquaintance. Because, Everett said, the whole reason this happened is that two young men looked at a stranger and saw a threat instead of a person, and the only cure he'd ever found for that was time spent close enough to learn a face. Sheriff Whitcomb stared at him. That's it. After what they did, that's what you want. That and their badge numbers, Everett said, and for the first time all morning the corner of his mouth moved. I did ask twice. Whitcomb didn't accept it, not entirely. He suspended Trent Mackey without pay for 30 days for putting a hand to his weapon and put a formal reprimand in Kyle Brennan's file, and made them both attend the training Everett asked for. The hardware store footage went to the county board, and there was a hearing, and Cheryl Danvers from the feed store had to sit through the whole thing and listen to the consequences of a phone call she'd made because a truck looked poor to her. The county paid to rebuild the pickup, every window, both tail lights, the mirrors, though Everett insisted they keep the old dent in the tailgate, because his wife used to laugh at that dent, and it wasn't theirs to fix. But the part nobody expected, the part that actually turned the department upside down, was the Saturdays, because Trent Mackey showed up. The first time, sullen and silent, sure it was a humiliation. He split wood for 4 hours and barely said 10 words. But Ranger, who forgives faster than any person, limped over on his bad hips halfway through the afternoon and dropped a chewed-up tennis ball at Trent's boots and waited. And something in that young man cracked open. He threw the ball. The old dog brought it back, and Trent Mackey sat down in the dirt beside a shepherd he'd once put his baton through the window at, and he cried, and Everett Calhoun let him and said nothing and just kept splitting wood. He came back the next month. And the one after. Kyle came too. By the 3rd month it wasn't a sentence anymore, it was a standing thing, and by the 6th month those 2 young deputies were bringing their own coffee and staying past dark to listen to an old admiral tell stories about places you can't find on a map. They learned to read a room. They learned that the poorest-looking man in it is often the one you least want to underestimate, and more than that it never mattered whether he was a general or a drifter, because you don't get to break a man's window either way. Trent Mackey is a sergeant now. He runs the de-escalation training for 3 counties, and there's a laminated card in every cruiser in Cedar Hollow, put there at his insistence, that lists exactly how to identify and treat a certified service animal. He drew it up himself. Everett still drives the same old truck, new glass, old dent. Ranger rode shotgun for 2 more good years before his hips finally gave out for the last time. And when that day came, it was Trent who dug the grave up at the cabin, in the soft ground under the pines, and it was Trent who stood there with the old admiral while they buried a gray-muzzled shepherd who'd spent his whole life standing between his person and harm. 2 men who'd started as enemies in a gravel lot, standing shoulder to shoulder over a dog that taught them both something no training ever could. You want to know what Everett said that day at the grave? Trent asked him how he'd stayed so calm that morning in the parking lot, when they were breaking his truck and hurting his dog, and he could have put them both down and been justified. And the old man looked out at the mountains a long while before he answered. Because the strongest thing I ever learned to do, he said, was not the thing that hurts somebody, it's the thing that stops. Anybody can swing a baton, takes a real man to kneel down in the glass and hold what he loves and refuse to become what's in front of him. He put a hand on Trent's shoulder. You know that now. That's worth more than my whole shoebox of medals. Come on. Ranger'd want us to have coffee, not stand here crying over him. And they walked back up to the cabin together, the old admiral and the young sergeant he'd once had every right to destroy and chose to build instead. Same truck in the drive, same dent in the tailgate. and a whole town that finally understood the thing it had gotten so wrong on a slow morning in a gravel lot. That you never, ever know who you're looking at, and that it shouldn't take an admiral's ID card to make you treat a man and his dog with the decency they were owed from the very first second.